always sad when I reach the end because I always feel like I'm just beginning. These topics are all so complex and they deserve so much time. So the first talk I gave was on the influence of neo-Confederacy, or the Confederate sort of model of the white nation, and how that is fed into American culture. And then last week we talked about Dylan Ruth, who sort of brought neo-Confederacy into alignment with neo-Nazism. And we talked about the significance of the kind of anti-Semitic narrative for the whole concept of the white nation. So today what we'll talk about is sort of how the systemic American racism that in some ways gives life to those more extremist positions. In other words, neo-Confederacy and neo-Nazism, most people will reject those. Most people will understand that these are what I'm calling the American pathology. These are obvious versions of pathological politics. But the sad thing is that there's a more normative American racism that I think gives life to these extreme movements. And that's what I want to talk about today. So that's the racism that is all around us, and in some ways is naturalized. We don't see it. Everybody recognizes, someone in a Klan outfit or someone with a swastika, but we don't pay the same mind to the more ubiquitous racism that I think is, in some ways, the deeper problem. Because as I say, most people will not identify with extremism, but if racism is taken to be part of the normal culture, then in some senses it's invisible. And if it's invisible, you can't attack it. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I've titled this talk, American Pathology, and I'm subtitling it Diagnosis, Symptoms, and Cure. Because I do believe that we can move beyond the sickness that is racism. And the last part of the talk will be about the positive, hopeful side. So I'm going to depress you, and then I'm going to do my best to raise your spirits. Okay, so the first part of the talk is on the color line. So and you can stop me at any point, because it's put together as a kind of conversation. So the color line. When lunchtime comes around in a typical American college, a question commonly asked is, why do all the black kids sit together? The question is somewhat remarkable, insofar as it suggests that African American youth are willfully separating themselves from other Americans who would readily accept their company. The question is remarkable because it is disingenuous. Given the contours of American history with its abysmal record of racial discrimination, a better question might be, why wouldn't the black kids sit together? And then again, what of an all-white group of students? Are they sticking together in a nationalistic or separatist manner? The question about racial grouping among students is evocative of the way that the United States lies to itself about the real nature of American culture. So, I see this at UConn. If you go into the dining rooms, you will see that pattern where you see lots of students separated by race. You don't only see that. And I do want to emphasize that. That's important. But you do see that as a pretty typical way in which people portion themselves out. But it's not the only way. You will see mixed groups. Residential segregation based on the myth of race is one of the most salient features of American social life. Who can fail to notice it? I remember when I first came here, and and I knew about the United States. I'd read it about it, but obviously it's a different thing when you see a culture in the flesh. And that was the thing that most struck me. And it struck me really hard because I always associated that with the South. And yet when I traveled across the country, and it's pretty much that way everywhere. And it's not like that in Europe. That was one of the things, kind of getting used to seeing that kind of segregated culture as just normal everywhere. Yet many Americans feign surprise or incredulity when segregation reveals itself in certain customs and social practices. So what I'm getting at is, I don't know why people would think it's strange that the black kids sit together, because that's the way the culture is set up. It's set up to promote that. In public discourse, one commonly hears the expression predominantly white neighborhood. and predominantly black school. This is what you see in newspapers. They use that phrase all the time. When really what they ought to be saying, they say, for example, schools in Detroit are predominantly black. They're not predominantly black, they're exclusively black. And neighborhoods are exclusively white. They're not predominantly white. Many of them are exclusively white. So it's a way of acknowledging a reality, but not acknowledging how did that come to be. These conventional phrases are treated as simple descriptions of social reality, as if the segregated housing and schooling were just neutral social phenomena. But in fact, segregation in all its dimensions is proof positive of the malign influence of racism on American society. Racism is the American pathology. That's what I want to talk about. That's the kind of more universal racism that we don't talk about. In his classic work, The Souls of Black Folk, from 1903, the great scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois famously noted, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Du Bois spoke of a metaphorical veil separating two worlds, the world of white America and the world of black America. The fact that we even use those phrases, white America, black America, is so telling. The veil image hints at the complex interplay of transparency and obscurity in white-black social relations. Veils are diaphanous. They emit a certain degree of light, allowing a measure of visibility. On the other hand, veils cover over. They make it difficult to see nuances, aspects, and fine details. Veils render the visible partly invisible. The color line, as a cultural logic of the veil, prevents whites and blacks from truly seeing each other. And that was the big point that Du Bois wanted to make, that Americans live together, but they don't really see each other. The veil allows for stereotypes, misconceptions, misperceptions, delusions, and myths to crowd in on the sense of the other. In this regard, the veil prevents individual persons from seeing and appreciating the full humanity of other persons on the other side of the racial divide. Racism denies the postulate that people can be best understood as individuals. I mean, I remember as a child growing up, and that was the thing that struck me as I became aware of race. That people, I mean, you know this when you're a victim of racism, that people don't see you as an individual because they don't even know you, right? And people might say things to you or give you a look, but they don't know you. So obviously they're not seeing you as an individual. And to me, that's probably the greatest human tragedy of racism. It makes it difficult for people just to see each other as individuals. I mean, it's hard enough being human as it is. And it's hard enough getting people to appreciate your individuality, because we all tend to think in general categories: man, woman, American, so on. So we all do that. We all classify people. But I think the tragedy of race is that, you know, we can get behind some of the other classifications, but it's very difficult to get behind this one. So those who live within and without the veil, that is black and white Americans. And obviously I think it's more complicated today. I'm really staying with Du Bois's argument, but today it's more than just black and white Americans. I mean, obviously Latinos and Muslim Americans and so forth. It's a much more complicated story. In fact, you know, if I had another chance, that's probably one of the things I would talk about, is that I think America of tomorrow is going to be black, brown, you know, it's going to be all kinds of people struggling for what America means. It's not just black and white. So those who live within and without the veil, that is black and white Americans, are deeply implicated in an imaginary realm of identity and social performance. In Black Boy, published in 1937, his autobiography of growing up in the Jim Crow South, Richard Wright points out that being black in America is an education, and that every African American who wants to survive in a system of discrimination and violent oppression has to, quote, learn how to live as a Negro. There's a great chapter that's often excerpt from the book. It's called The Ethics of Living Jim Crow. And it's all about how blacks have to learn how to negotiate the complex social interactions with whites. So for example, one of the things that if you're walking the street and a white man is coming towards you, you have to step aside. Or if he looks you in the face, you have to look down to the ground, because you can't do anything that is suggestive of equality. Right? And so he says you have to learn that as a kid. You know, that if someone talks to you, you know, you look down, you don't give them the suggestion that you're in any sense equal to them. So that's what I mean about that. It's a kind of theatre. You have to learn how to play out that role. But if it's true that blacks had to learn how to be Negroes, it's frequently forgotten that segregation compelled whites to act white. The white individual who failed to live up to his whiteness might be described as a traitor to his race, or even worse, a nigger lover. Right? I think that's important. We forget. Segregation oppressed white people too, because it didn't allow them to act in any way they chose. You had to act like a white person, whatever that meant in any given context. And there were clearly people, you know, I mean, we know there was relationships across the color line, friendships, all this kind of stuff, and it clearly affected people. And people saw things, obviously. I mean, one of the things that haunts me when I think about American history is you must have seen those postcards of lynchings, and because you know that sometimes people would take photographs and then postcards would be made out of them. And what's so shocking, what's horrific? I mean, it's bad enough what you're seeing, but the children that were there, the children that were brought, and I often wonder, what happened to those children? When they went home, what did they think about their parents? Who would bring a child to some of these? I mean, some of the things that happened at these events are so horrific. I mean, mutilations, etc. I mean, just terrible. Who would expose a child to that? I mean, we don't know that history. We don't know what happened to those children, what they did with their trauma. Were they traumatized? Did they become callous? You know, these are questions that need to be asked, because obviously these children went on to be the parents of the next generation. And what did they pass on? This is the sense in which I think segregation hurts white people too. See, that's important to see, that it's not just one side of it. It hurts the people who are the oppressor. So the veil functions like a wall, blocking off the moral understanding of wider human community wherein race is irrelevant. When people are caught up in mythic and terrible social distinctions, they can hardly approach the true sense of being human. The veil is essentially a prison. So in that sense, racism is typical of a failing that we see across the world in different ways. That when people get caught up in these distinctions that are essentially meaningless, and they're killing each other over stuff that you can't even understand. You know, in the end, it comes. There's, you know, I don't. If you've read Gulliver's Travels, you remember there's a controversy about whether to break an egg at one point or another, and Swift says this is religion. Essentially, people are, you know, and it's within the same religion. It's one thing. People, co-religionists are killing each other because they said, no, break the egg this way, break it that way. So much of human culture is like that, really, when you look at it. It's trivial stuff that people are dying with. So the veil is essentially a prison.
Jerry, when you talked about those parents bringing those kids to the lynchings and so forth, and you previously mentioned learning to be white, learning to be black, it seems to me that the kids are being taught that the people that are lynched are less than human.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's and so you're desensitizing the kids to the treatment of a whole race that is, and teaching them to some degree that they're less than human.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that's so tragic, I mean, and there's a brilliant book by a woman called Mab Segrest. It's called A Race Trait or something like that. She grew up as a white woman in Kentucky, and you know, poor conditions. And it's about coming to the awareness about how damaging whiteness was to her. And I think the thing that's hard is the love gets bound up with the hate. The love for your parents gets bound up with the hatred of black people, and you know, and all the complications that involves. It's difficult to think of, because I think there must have been children who were horrified. There has to be. I mean, it's just normal. Just, you know, if you've seen someone burning alive, when they're screaming and all the rest of it, any human being is going to feel something. And I think you have to fight yourself not to feel it. Right. That's the horror. You have to fight that because your parents brought you there, so you can't believe that they want you to see this if it's a bad thing. You have to believe that it's actually something that is good. Okay, so the philosopher Martin Heidegger observes that just as animals live in specific environments, being human is a matter of having a particular world. The phenomenon of the world, as Heidegger calls it, is a matter of what shows up in the practices, values, desires, customs, and so on that constitute distinct ways of human being. Under the rule of the veil, what primarily shows up in the world as the leading phenomenon is race and its various pathologies. Du Bois speaks of the white world and the black world. The world is race and race is the world. The social separation of the races issuing in two separate worlds creates a frightful chasm at the colour line across which men pass at their peril, as Du Bois puts it. In short, the colour line is not just a veil, a prison, or a wall. It is also an abyss, a void which threatens to engulf the American experiment in democratic republicanism. Segregation took in all areas of social life, from housing and schooling to transportation, recreation, worship, healthcare, and criminal justice. Even the cemeteries were segregated by race in the Jim Crow South. It's as if African Americans were an alien species unfit for true human society. Out of the depths of slavery, wrote Frederick Douglass in 1881, has come this prejudice, this colour line. Segregation, or colour line feeling, as Douglass astutely calls it, was in one respect a substitute social arrangement for the racial order of the slave system. I like that phrase, colour line feeling, because it gets to the sense in which racism is about the emotions. I mean, racism is primarily an emotional response to the world. It's obviously not really a logic. As much as it presents it or tries to pass itself off as logical, scientific racism and all this stuff, it's actually both based in emotion, in disgust, hate, things like that. Under the slave system, blacks were a wholly subject people. Segregation was conceived to keep blacks subject in the absence of slavery. In other words, segregation was in principle slavery without slavery. There's a wonderful book by a historian, Ola Schenke. It's called, I've got my title now. It's about the prison farm system that was in the South, Parchment Farm. It's called something like Slavery After Slavery, I've forgotten the title. And he shows basically how the prison farms were essentially a neo-form of slavery. So segregation was in principle slavery without slavery. Slavery cast blacks as abject creatures, as, quote, a subordinate and inferior class of beings who could be traded back and forth as articles of property for the economic profit of traders and masters. As non-persons who approximated both animals and things, slaves had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. I am quoting here the language of Chief Justice Roger Taney, who ruled in the infamous Dred Scott case of 1857 that African Americans were not and were never intended to be lawful citizens of the United States. I mean, one of the most interesting and appalling legal decisions was essentially, what Taney said was that blacks were not included in the phrase persons, and therefore not included in the concept of citizen. Douglass noted, a truth for all time, that once a class of persons is degraded into menials and common drudges, oppressed and dejected for centuries, it becomes easy enough to further dehumanize them by investing their alleged native character with all sorts of odious peculiarities. So in other words, once people are doing drudge work or menial work, then it's easy enough to say that that's what they ought to be doing, because they're that kind of people. It has always been true, at least for the master class and its defenders, that those who suffered the horrors of enslavement, in some sense, deserve their fate. The low social status of the slaves makes them a pariah class in caste-like terms. Slaves have no claims on honor and respect. In a society based on rank and privilege as marks of distinction, the free man will always strive to distinguish himself from the degraded human chattels in his midst. For him, it is a fate worse than death to be associated with slaves in any way. In the antebellum United States, racism was the primary way that the free population of whites arrived at distinction. In other words, black subjection was integral to white apotheosis. As noted by slavery apologist James DeVal, the presence of Negro slaves as the resident class of menials meant that, quote, the non-slaveholder of the South preserves the status of the white man and is not regarded as an inferior or a dependent. Black degradation makes all white men socially equal. Or to put it another way, in order to find its optimum working conditions, democratic republicanism is in some sense dependent upon the exclusion and subjection of an oppressed class of people. So what I'm saying is that the only way social equality could have been achieved among the white population of the United States was to have a group of people that everyone was superior to. You know, because obviously class distinctions, I mean, if you think about Britain and its experience, I mean, although there was the language of liberty and equality, but everybody understood that Britain was a class society and that there's no sense in which a miner in the north of England was equal to an aristocrat in the south of England. Nobody had the pretension. But in the United States, which was full republic, the only way equality could really be achieved was to say, okay, well, all are equal in the terms of race. And that seemed to have a certain credibility because the most menial jobs were not done by whites. I mean, this is why it was very complicated when the Irish arrived in large numbers, because the Irish came in as a degraded people. They were people who were thought of in lowly terms in Europe. And so there was a prejudice towards the Irish, and they were pushed towards the black end of the spectrum. And of course, the Irish resisted that, because in terms of, there was one instance, I just want to finish this thought. There was one instance, a famous instance of where, this was in Georgia, where Irish laborers were used to build a canal instead of slaves because slaves were too valuable to risk. They said, who cares about the Irish? Let them do it. But you can see the problem with that is that then when the Irish realized that they were people of very low social status, this gave them a tremendous investment in white racism. And so the Irish were among the most racist of immigrant groups in the 19th century. I mean, you may know, culminating in the New York riots of 1863. And that's a tragedy too, because the reason why that partly happened is because, you know, if you could pay money, you could get out of the draft. And the Irish immigrants, of course, came with nothing. They couldn't get out of the draft. So they felt angered by what was obviously an unjust policy, but they took it out on blacks. Sorry.
Okay. I don't know if this is a contradiction to what you're saying or a new way of looking at it, and that's economics, because, you know, of course, the economic interpretation of the Constitution, including, I mean, all voters were white males of property. I mean, Benjamin Franklin wanted other tradesmen in, but no, it had to be. And I always thought that in the South, that the property, that the upper classes used blackness as a way to keep control or to keep the lower class whites in line.
Absolutely.
So is that
in
addition to? Or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And, you know, that's the story of the 19th century, is the growing democratization of American society.
Except for blacks.
Except for blacks. And also, you know, Chinese Americans, remember, were also excluded.
Yes.
So, you know, but it's true what you're saying, that as you see the growth of democratic politics, you also see a tremendous investment in white supremacy. It's why the Democratic Party essentially was the party of the slaveholder at the South and the party of the working man at the North. There was an alliance, and it was clearly based on white supremacy. Okay, so to put it another way, in order to find its optimal working conditions, democratic republicanism is in some sense dependent upon the exclusion and subjection of an oppressed class of people. From this perspective, racism is not a negative value that stands in opposition to the American creed, as many scholars have tried to present it. Racism is rather a central part of the American creed. It is as American as anything else. And I do believe that is true. I think that it's a big mistake to try and say that racism is somehow not true to American history. That's just not true. It is fundamental to American history. It's fundamental to American politics. So notwithstanding the opinion of the US Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, the case that established the legality of segregation, that separate but equal accommodations based on race are lawful and morally permissible, the whole point of segregation in theory and practice is to produce and reproduce unequal social outcomes, between the worlds of black and white Americans. And I should also point out, Plessy versus Ferguson was interesting because what they did, it was, southern states were passing these laws prescribing black freedom. And, the people who were opposed to that said, well, we need to get this into the federal courts. We need a suit that will declare these laws as unconstitutional. So what they did is they chose Homer Plessy, who was a very light-skinned African-American man, right? And they said, you go into the white part of the bus and we'll see what, I think it was a train actually, or a carriage, and we'll see what happens. So of course he gets, told you can't be here, it's illegal, but they deliberately made it so that you would see the absurdity of race. So they didn't choose a dark-skinned person, they chose a light-skinned person to show how the whole thing was absurd, and of course it didn't work, right? Because blackness in the South has nothing to do with skin color, as I'm sure people know. Blackness in the South has to do with ancestry. It's not phenotypical. This was something that shocked abolitionists when they went south, and they would see people on the slave markets, and they'd see what looked to them like white people being sold. They couldn't figure it out, but because the person was known to have some black ancestry, that classifies them as black. But visually, they would have been white. I mean, there's no way you would know. So the whole point of segregation is to produce inequality. That's why the separate but equal doctrine is nonsense. There's no possibility of that. As a social and economic arrangement, segregation is characterized by stark inequality in housing, schooling, employment, environmental well-being, healthcare, recreation, and provision of municipal services, the standards of policing. I mean, that's still true today. If you go into so-called black neighborhoods, it's striking how different it is. I mean, the lack of supermarkets, the lack of road care, etc., etc. It's another world from the point of view of comparing it to a suburban white neighborhood. The so-called ghettos and barrios of the American inner city are not accidents. They are the predictable outcomes of public and private policies based in colorline feeling. So complete is the system of racial segregation in the United States that scholars have described it as American apartheid. There's a book that just came out by Rothstein. It's called The Color of Law. I don't know if anyone knows this book. And it's about how the US government policies created the segregated system that we see today in terms of housing loans, urban development, etc. I mean, a very complicated story, but he lays it all out. It's a convincing argument. Throughout the 19th century, the fantasy persisted that African Americans might be deported en masse from the United States, making the notion of a white man's country, which was a familiar phrase in the 19th century, the notion of a white man's country finally come true. Thomas Jefferson was adamant that should emancipation ever come to pass, blacks, quote, should be colonized to such a place as the circumstances of the time should render most proper. So he was a colonizationist, as was Abraham Lincoln, possibly the greatest American president, but he was also convinced blacks should be colonized from the country. Jefferson was simply unable to imagine blacks among whites on terms of social equality. It was easier for him to envisage the mass expulsion of the blacks. So for Jefferson, the possible was fully impossible, and the improbable was conceived as entirely possible. Let me read that again. The possible, for Jefferson, the possible was fully impossible. So the idea that blacks and whites might live together, which is possible, for him was impossible. And the improbable was conceived as entirely possible. The improbable meaning the complete deportation of the black population. You'd have to say it's improbable because deportations have happened in human history. We know. I mean,
ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, ethnic cleansing, and also expulsions of population have happened. So you couldn't say it's impossible, right? I mean, obviously the Muslims were expelled from Spain and Grenada. So there are paradigms. Yeah, Jewish populations deported from Europe, but this was prior, obviously, to that. So there are precedents for mass expulsions of populations, but it has to be said it's improbable, right? I mean, it's just not likely. And obviously you get into questions of who's even black once you started doing that. right? So but for Jefferson, it was easier to imagine that than to imagine blacks and whites living together. And I'm saying that's a kind of insanity.
Yes, I've read that Jefferson did some figuring out to see about his black children, you know, with Sally Hemings, how many generations it would take, or they're in his notes, in his handwriting. And so he must have felt that eventually they could become white if they kept them.
That was
these are his notes.
Yeah.
Right.
That was his view of Native Americans.
Yes.
He thought that Native Americans eventually would just be assimilated into the American race, but he felt with blacks and whites that wouldn't happen. Although, of course,
with his children,
sure.
he thought maybe.
Well, of course, and
Yes.
you know, the Southerners who talked that way were deluding themselves, because all around them were the issue of masters and slavery.
Yes.
All around them. I mean, so clearly they knew better in reality, but in terms of ideas, they presented it as, oh no, we can't have amalgamation.
Jerry, I know you're going to address anti-Semitism shortly, but I would like to mention it right this minute, because that's what I have been sitting here thinking in all of this discussion, how similar in many ways our experiences.
Oh yeah. Well, I said last week that,
Yes,
racism and anti-Semitism are parallel logics, and they don't develop. They don't develop. They're pretty much what people thought in the 19th century is what they think today. The language is a little bit different, you know, and obviously the paradigms that they draw on genetics and so on, but it's the same. But it can't develop. It's a sterile form of thought, obviously, because it's not real. It's not based on anything that is real. So there's nowhere for it to go. It's not like if you were a racist or an anti-Semite, you're waiting for evidence. You already know what you know, and there's no evidence that you don't need evidence. So for Jefferson, the possible was fully impossible, and the improbable was conceived as entirely possible. Such is the rationality of colour feeling. The historian Joel Williamson writes that, quote, in time it became evident that the Negro would neither be dissolved nor transported to Africa. In a sense, separation was a means of securing the quasi-elimination of the Negro at home. The notion of segregation as a policy of quasi-elimination is particularly interesting. It suggests that African Americans are consistently entertained in an ambiguous light when it comes to considering their place in the American body politic. On the one hand, a space is carved out for them as the pariah group, the lowest of the low, in a racial caste system. On the other hand, they are viewed as a contaminating element that ought to be eliminated from American society. No space should be given to them, no place should be made for them. In short, segregation is not just about subjection and degradation, it implicitly contains a genocidal logic. So that's one of the things that I think is horrible about the systemic racism. It keeps that alive, keeps that sense alive. In the contemporary United States, black and brown people serve symbolically as potent images of the poor. I mean, it's remarkable that poverty in the United States is actually white. Most poor people are white. Most people who draw on welfare are white. But that's not the image. The image is black and brown. In his brilliant study, The Cunning of History from 1975, which reflects on the Holocaust and the American future, this is a book I recommend everybody read. It's only like 100 pages. It's called The Cunning of History. It's a fantastic book. The Cunning of History. It's a phrase from Hegel. And the author is Richard Rubenstein. And what it's about is the way that the Holocaust is indicative of modern society. It's a fantastic book. Very depressing, but sort of a necessary book, you know, if you want to understand where we are. But Richard Rubenstein notes that there could come a time when, quote, bureaucrats might attempt to eliminate all the ills associated with urban blight by eliminating those sectors of the population that are regarded as most prone to social pathology. Can there be any doubt that if genocidal violence was brought to bear against the poor as a form of social cleansing, blacks would feature heavily among the victims? Rubenstein observes that the chilling lesson taught by Auschwitz is, quote, that people who are rendered permanently superfluous are eventually condemned in segregated precincts of the living dead or exterminated outright. In the light of this argument, one thinks of the scores of black ghettos in America's dead and dying cities. What will become of them in the American future? dare we ignore Rubinstein's thesis? See, that to me is kind of a very scary thought, that, because no one can look down the road that far. Nobody knows. Nobody knows that what he's saying is impossible. And if it's even possible or probable, that's scary. Okay, so the next section is the permanence of racism. The legal scholar, Derek Bell, has written powerfully of, quote, the elusive quest for racial justice as a consequence of the permanence of racism. Bell argues that racism is a key component of this country's stability, for which reason it will not be given up very easily, if at all. Quote, identifying vicariously with those at the top, obsessed with barring blacks from eroding their racial priority for jobs and other resources, most whites accept their relatively low social status. In general, lower-class whites show tolerance for, quote, the tremendous disparity in income, wealth, and opportunity that characterizes American society, just so long as they are permitted, in some important sense, to lord it over the blacks. W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out that going back to slavery days, whiteness was always about honor, respect, and privilege, given to all whites by virtue of being whites, but also making sure that none of these social values were ever extended to the blacks. In other words, whereas whiteness has been linked to political and economic benefits, one should not downplay its importance as a psychological wage. That's a phrase from W.E.B. Du Bois. That's whiteness as a psychological wage, paid to those on the lower rungs of the social ladder. As black gains in civil rights have brought on formal social equality, the psychological wage of whiteness has been devalued, as it is no longer lawful for white men to command respect and demand black subjection solely because of the white color of their skins. Faced with a devalued psychological currency on their hands, and with their economic fortunes declining because of profound transformations to an American economy, many white men have retreated deeper into an angry and frustrated racism. Their hostility is not directed towards the politicians and corporate managers who make the policies that hurt them. Instead, they vent their rage downwards towards those who, in many instances, suffer worse from the deprivations of poverty and injustice. In The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain painted a memorable picture of white righteous anger in the figure of Pat Finn. Pat learned that a free nigger from Ohio was able to exercise the vote. This greatly upset Pat. If a nigger was allowed to vote, then how was voting a proper privilege of the white man? Pat said he would never vote again, a classic instance of cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. And obviously Twain thinks Twain is parodying, satirizing the whole absurdity of that kind of racism. Because obviously Pat is himself an illiterate, drunkard, terrible person, and he's complaining about a free nigger from Ohio getting a vote. Pat's reaction uncannily anticipates the political behavior of many lower-caste whites as described by Jonathan Metzl in his recent book, Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. This is a very interesting book. It's just published. It's like 6 months out. It's a 2019 book. Metzl shows how hostility to black social equality is a driving force in leading lower-class whites to embrace conservative and reactionary policies that benefit the rich and actually end up hurting the lower class, sometimes to deadly effect. Whiteness is literally killing whites in the sense that racial resentment makes it difficult, if not impossible, to enact the progressive policies that would improve the general welfare of the American people. Again, this is entirely consistent with much of American history. Lower-class whites across the South lent their support to the slave-owning class, even though slavery had little to offer them, beyond the Pyrrhic sense of superiority over brutalized slaves. Eventually, the mean whites, as they were called, followed their betters into a disastrous civil war. Hundreds of thousands were killed, and in the end, it was all for white supremacy, as few Confederate foot soldiers were rich in slaves. So I'm saying that this behavior that we see today is typical. It's a pattern in American history, where people, instead of looking up, look down and feel this alliance with a group of people who actually don't have their interest in mind. The ruling class of the South did not have the interest of poor farmers or poor whites in the South. They had their own interests in mind. There was a brilliant book written by Hinton, a guy called Hinton Helper. It was called The Impending Crisis. And he was a very racist person, but the book was a devastating attack on the plantocracy. He basically said these people are going to drive the South into destruction just because they want their slaves. You know, what do we get out of it as poor whites? We don't get anything out of it. We have to serve in their slave patrols. We have to run the risk of slave insurrections, all of this stuff, and we don't even get anything out of it. And they treat us terribly. They look down upon us like we're white trash. So, and this book was considered obviously very incendiary, because it was basically an abolitionist book, but written by a white supremacist. You know, it's so bizarre. He hated blacks and he hated the slave owners. He was another one who argued blacks should be colonized out of the country.
Just like the Jews in North Africa.
Mm. Yeah.
A similar thing.
Yeah.
You have to find a place.
Was not Monrovia created?
Yes, it was. Yeah. In Liberia. Yeah. Oh, I mean, part of the absurdity of colonization is that in the end, I think it was perhaps 50, 60,000 people who were colonized out of a population of over 4 million. I mean, it's ludicrous.
It's not really sending them back, were they?
No, they were Americans. They were Americans, yeah. And that led to, and that caused some interesting problems, because they went there with the force of the American government behind them, and they kind of became a ruling group over the native Liberians. So that's a kind of interesting story in its own right. So basically, I'm just saying that it's not surprising in a way that we have this disjunction between class and race, because we've always seen that in American history. Okay, so this section is American pathology. Frederick Douglass said that when he visited England, he experienced much less prejudice against colour than what he had suffered in the United States. Indeed, Douglass contended that whatever racism had reached English shores was brought there by Americans, quote, carried there as a moral disease from an infected country. No doubt, Douglass underestimated the degree of native racism in England. In fact, I know he did. I don't think it's fair to blame it all on Americans. I think the English are quite capable of being racist on their own. But his main point is clear. The United States is a morally diseased country. It is a nation made sick by the virus of racism. One of the most striking signs of the American pathology is that many Americans don't even regard it as abnormal. In other words, racism is so normal it seems natural. Americans have great difficulty seeing, let alone imagining, the world in non-racial terms. The sickness has its symptoms, so I'm just going to read a few things that I think are indicative of the American pathology. The American pathology reveals itself in the failure of the United States to generate a truly liberal state, wherein substantive social welfare for the populace is axiomatic. The United States is often called the exceptional country, and I don't really believe that that's meaningful, but I do think it's exceptional in regard to the fact that it's an incomplete Enlightenment country. It's not a truly liberal society in the way that Germany, France, those societies, liberalism kind of triumphed. And what I mean, and I'm talking about philosophical liberalism, I'm not talking about whether someone identifies. The idea, in other words, that most people will accept liberty, equality, fraternity. You know, that's pretty much accepted in much of Europe. It's not accepted in the United States, and that's a problem. It's no accident that the ex-Confederate states are among the most conservative states in the nation, constituting a drag on progressive liberalism at the federal level. And this is a story, too, that can be told. I mean, even the New Deal was a completely compromised set of policies because the South refused to go along. The South blocked Social Security for agricultural workers because blacks were only agriculture. There were a number of things that they did to prevent the benefits accruing to the black population of the South, and it affected the entire federal system. The United States is a wealthy country, and yet Americans die and go bankrupt for want of health insurance. Racism is a major part of the problem because, as Jonathan Metzl shows in Dying of Whiteness, a good deal of opposition to the Affordable Care Act is grounded in racial resentment. Some white Americans are following the line of Pat Finn. They don't want government-sponsored healthcare if it means that niggers get it as well. And then there are the millions who don't want to support their fellow Americans through taxes. That's the reality. That's how it actually is, if we're honest. A lot of Metzl interviews people in I think it's in Tennessee, and he separated the groups by race because he thought if you put blacks and whites together, you wouldn't really get honest discussions. So he separated the groups by race, and a number of the white people said, we don't support the ACA because we don't want the blacks and the Muslims and all the rest of it to get it. And there was a guy in there, I think I mentioned this like last week, there was a guy in there who was on, he was with an oxygen tank, and he was literally dying. And he said, and he could barely afford his medications, and he said, yeah, I think it's right, don't give people affordable care. And that's, you can't understand that outside of the history of race in America. Another sign of the American pathology is segregated schooling, which helps to produce vast social distances between communities, ultimately leading to hostility and/or social indifference. Integrated schools would not solve all Americans' problems, but there can be little doubt that people seem more human to each other when they grow up and learn together in the same classroom. So I think that's a big part of the issue. If kids had to grow up together, there would be issues. Of course there would be, but it would be a different world. And I think Americans are so used to this one that they don't even realize what they might be losing by not having integrated schools. The American pathology is visible in the criminal justice system. The racial biases built into the application of American law make a mockery of the Constitution, which is supposed to guarantee equality for all. Study after study has shown that blacks and whites are sentenced differently for the same crime. So there's just no doubt about that. It's just factually true that that's the case. And that's not equality before the law. The American pathology is strikingly obvious in the white supremacist and white nationalist, anti-Semitic, violent rampages that are all too common. We have seen attacks on black churches, Jewish synagogues, and Islamic mosques. And we all know that there are more attacks coming. We don't know when and where, but we know that more attacks are certain. Right? I think we're only at the beginning of it. I don't think we're at the end of it at all. The appeal to make America great again is also indicative of the American pathology. The notion that America was great in the past and has now lost its way covers over a shameful history of racial oppression, including pogroms, lynching, systematic discrimination, and other inhuman practices. The idea that America was great when it tolerated these behaviors is a gross insult to every American who has fought against the evils of racism. And I particularly think of those people who went down to the South in the 60s, the bravery of those people. Fantastic. That's the best of America. That's what the country should celebrate. The people who did that, who knew that when they got off the bus, people were waiting for them with axe handles, pickup. You knew you were walking into that, and they still went. I mean, that's the side of the United States that gives me hope. And it's still there. The people who did that, they are still there. That's why I think I don't want to suggest that it's all one terrible story, because I don't think that's true. I think that part of the story is fantastic. And that's why I think it's a mistake to celebrate the past, ignoring who those people were and the sacrifices that they made, so that we actually could live in a half-decent society. Not a few of those people lost their lives at the hands of violent terror. Then again, Make America Great seems to suggest that the United States has failed, that the country is in a hopeless condition unless we return to some paradisial American past. I mean, one thing I think about that phrase, this is not an attack on anyone who particularly voted for Donald Trump, but it is an attack on Donald Trump. I actually don't think he likes the United States. I don't think he loves no, I'm serious, I don't think he does. He talks about the United States as if all the range of Americans who are actually the country don't exist. If you love the United States, you've got to love everybody in it. You've got to accept everybody in it, because that's what the United States is. If you want to imagine a United States absent of certain groups of people, you don't love the United States. You have a myth. in your mind of what the United States is. And to hear him talk about the United States weak and hopeless and all this kind of stuff, I don't think that is expressive of love of nation. That's just my view of Donald Trump. I'm not saying anything about anyone who voted for him, but as him as an individual, I do not see that he really understands this country or respects its history or respects its people. So, make America great suggests that America is not great. I think the country is great, not in his terms, but I do think it's a great country. So, I think it's surely wrong to suggest that the only way the United States could be great is to go back. I think that's wrong. The United States has many grave problems, but this is true of just about every society on earth. So, it's not just an American problem, and that's important too. It's not just race is a problem, ethno-nationalism, anti-Semitism, it's everywhere. And the rule of the rich to the harm, detriment, that's everywhere too. So when I'm criticizing the United States, I'm not criticizing the United States as if only the United States was susceptible to these kinds of criticisms. But what the United States has going for it as a positive life value is the tremendous cultural energy of a diverse, creative, and liberal-minded populace. The American experiment is still unfinished. There is still time to achieve the Whitmanesque vision of the United States as the greatest poem. See, I believe that. I still think the country can be what Walt Whitman saw it as being, the nation of nations, the greatest poem, in the sense that the greatest creation of humankind. I think that's possible. But time's running out. I mean, if we want that, then we better work for it, because time is running out. It's not necessarily on our side. But one thing is clear. American transcendence is in the future rather than the past. That's why I object to saying great again. If America wants to be truly great, it has to let go of the illusion of being great again. Let me say that again. If America wants to be truly great, it has to let go of the illusion of being great again. The greatness is ahead of us. It's not behind us. It's not behind us. There's just too much horror in the American past to call that greatness. But could there be greatness in the future? Absolutely. So I'm going to finish on a positive note. And I called this the way out. And I have 10 points, and I'm just read them and we can debate them. So these are the way out of the prison, the way out of the past that traps us. The first thing is love one another. Live by the principle that nothing human is foreign to me. Second, live together. Make your home in an integrated neighborhood whenever and wherever possible. Number 3, dream of a better world. Ignore the skeptics who scorn dreams. The world has never been bettered without the dream of a better world as a guiding principle. So one of the things I think that is harmful to us is we're told be realistic. What's realistic about allowing people getting shot in synagogues and mosques? What's realistic about that? I'd rather dream of a world where that doesn't happen. Number 4, act in accordance with the dream. It's the only way to make the dream reality. Act as if the future was already here. Number 5, more important than fame or riches, strive to be a good citizen. I mentioned this last week. I think there's a big problem in the United States. People have a degraded sense of citizenship. Because one of the ways that reveals itself is Americans refuse to take care of each other. I mean, a citizen takes care of the republic. The republic is the people. That's what it is. It's not the state. It's not some flag. It's not the oath of allegiance. The republic is the other citizenry. And if you don't take care of the other citizenry, you're not a good citizen. And I'm only following Plato and Aristotle and every other theorist of republics when I say that. Number 6, practice race treason. Whenever possible, show loyalty to humanity. Don't think of yourself as a member of a race. Act like all human beings are human beings. That's what we have to do. If we want to see this thing go, that's what we have to do. We have to do it in our own lives. Number 7, love yourself. Love your life however mean it is, as Thoreau put it, so that you don't find solace or compensation in hating others. That's what's wrong with, was wrong with Dylan Roof and people like him. They don't love themselves enough. They don't believe in who they are as human beings. They have to hide behind something like whiteness, masculinity, a gun, Americanism. They just can't accept that they're human the way everybody else is and that they have the same issues. We're all afraid of death. We're all afraid of sickness. We all are disappointed in love, all of us. It's no harder for them than it is for us. In fact, it's sometimes harder for us because of what they do to us, right? But life is hard for everybody. So why should they get a pass? Why should they feel that they somehow need to be accommodated in the fears that they have? That you name a human being, we all have fears. So learn to love yourself, and so that you don't have to go to hate. You don't have to go to hate to make your life meaningful. There's a powerful book by Christian Piccolini. It's called Romantic Violence, and it's the memoirs of an American skinhead. And it's a really interesting book, and it's about how he grew up and became a neo-Nazi, and for many years was involved in violence. That's the romantic violence, attacking people on the streets and all this kind of stuff. And then he realized at a certain point in his life that he was doing it because he hated himself. He was all this stuff about white pride and love of the white race and all the rest of it, and he realized that actually, no, my life is kind of empty. I don't really like the person that I am. And so since that, he's become a committed anti-Nazi activist. But he's the one who he realized that a lot of hate is driven by self-hatred or the failure to accept oneself. Number 8, rise above demeaning customs. Reject racist jokes. Don't join an all-white golf club. Be ready to condemn those who put on blackface. Right? These are the things that we can do in our own lives. When people make a racist joke or anti-Semitic joke, object to it. Don't let them get away with it, because once you let them get away with it, you're part of it. You're telling them that this is okay. We have to make those things unacceptable. It's not that they can't think what they can think, because nobody can make you change your mind. But they don't have a right to voice their racism or their anti-Semitism around us. Or at least if they have a right, they don't have a right to be heard. They can say what they want, but we don't have to listen. Number 9, practice humility. Practice humility. Racism is false pride. There is no such thing as a humble racist. A humble person is a soil in which the plant of racism cannot easily grow. With every passing day, become more human and get more human. Right. Humility, that's hard, right? We know. Every moral teacher has said this, to be humble. That's what I mean about people who feel like they somehow should be owed the right to be above somebody else. They're not entitled to that. Nobody is. So they should be humble. Number 10, commit yourself to struggles for peace and justice. The ultimate logic of racism is war, slavery, and genocide. Think always of the world you would want children to live in. Be realistic, but don't fall captive to despair. Hope is always needed. And I'll stop there.
Could you comment on unconscious racism?
Or implicit bias, or well, I think that's part of who we are, right? As human beings, that a lot of what we do is at an unconscious level. This has been shown by cognitive scientists, by psychoanalysts, that we don't have to be aware of what we're doing to be doing something. Just think of, men, for example, I'll give you an example that's obvious. A lot of men are not aware of the way they look at women, right? They might, especially in a sexual way. They're not necessarily aware of it, but the women are aware. And that kind of unconscious, men can be made aware of that. That when they look at a woman, don't look at her chest, look at her face. So unconscious behavior is just normal human behavior, and a lot of human behavior is in that realm. But we can become conscious of it, and once we become conscious of it, then we have a purchase on it. We can change things. So I think that I'm all for this kind of diversity training where people are shown unconscious, implicit bias and so forth. I think that's necessary. Because I don't assume that everybody is racist in a conscious or, harmful way. A lot of our racism is simply learned at an unconscious level. You know, it's things that we do. For example, I can give you an example. I remember on one occasion I was in a shop and the shopkeeper was handing me back money. But instead of giving it to me in my hand, I got my hand like that, she just dropped it. And I immediately understood what that was about. Like, I'm not going to do something that looks like I'm serving you. If you want your money, you're going to have to pick it up from the table. Now, she probably didn't think to herself, I'm going to do this. She just did it. She just did it. And I could read what it meant. Because you put your hand right there, and she just drops the money on the table.
I think another example is for just this past fall, PBS, a liberal network, had the Great American Read, where people nominated books for the best books ever, and then they put the top 100, or the ones that got the most votes, the top 100, up for a vote for the greatest American read. And I was appalled to see that Gone with the Wind was something like number 12.
Oh my God. Oh, there's at least 50,000 books that are better than Gone with the Wind.
And the number one was To Kill a Mockingbird.
I still don't consider that one a great novel. Huck Finn is a considerably better
That was in
book.
there too, but I don't think it ranked as high as Gone with the Wind.
But now Gone with the Wind was number 12. Wow.
Well, I don't know the exact number, but it was too high for my opinion.
Yeah.
I didn't think it deserved to be on the list.
No.
But if I can comment on Gone with the Wind, because I have read that most Americans learned their Civil War and Reconstruction history from Gone with the Wind. And I had a very dear but departed neighbor who once was reading Gone with the Wind and said to me she was surprised that the black slaves didn't want to be free. And I said, how did you? She said, I'm reading Gone with the Wind, and that's what that says. It's just appalling. Right. And especially as a former teacher, Bill, you must know this about American history. It's just bad.
The question was, or the comment was, that Gone with the Wind is a book that encourages a kind of false view of American history, and one of the ways it does that is to suggest that the slaves on the plantations during the war had no interest in actually fleeing the plantations, but were loyal to their masters, which is part of the Confederate myth. And obviously it's a way of justifying the slave system. I think there was, if I remember the order, I think you were next, and then I think there was a hand here, and then a hand at the back. Just remember the order.
I don't think that racism is getting worse for this reason. I think that, I gotta be honest, I think Trump has allowed people to express feelings they would have never expressed before.
Absolutely.
And I grew up in the segregated South. Where I have optimism, because I always look for the silver lining, is in the amount of people that are marrying across the race line. And even with Judaism. You know, I look at, to me, that's all positive. And so it makes it hard to decide who you're gonna hate when you find that, that this is happening. And the more this happens, the better we're gonna be. We'll hate for other reasons, but we won't be able to hate for that.
No, I mean, some people have thought that would be the saving of America, the browning of America, so to speak. I'm not so sure, but I think it will. It's definitely a positive factor.
They're gonna hate for other reasons, but we won't hate for that reason.
I mean, because what it does is it brings, people of different races into the same family.
Right. Yes, exactly.
And then it's tough. Then it's very tough to maintain the distance. I think there was a hand, right, sir? I think you were next. Yeah.
Well, first about hidden racism, just a very short remark. I experienced it with my mother in Germany, who was absolutely had nothing. You have to wait for a situation for racism to show its face. And with her it was when I was planning to marry an Asian, a Vietnamese. She completely flipped out. She came from Riga, from the old Russia, and there was this firm idea that you had this yellow menace, the yellow danger coming from the east, and she was convinced that she had to save me from this horrible Vietnamese woman. So that's just about how hidden racism can work. Maybe not appear at all until you come into a situation. But I have another, that's a personal just memory that came up. But I have another question. That is, what disturbs me a lot more and more, and that is, in many talks, you cannot avoid getting into this polarization of black versus white. It's all the time, again and again and again, when there's actually no either or, there is a decision in the language, how we talk about it, to either say black or white. Best example, Obama. Why was he called black? Why wasn't he called half black? And in general, do you have any idea, if you talk about blacks versus white people, and if you now take all the blacks that you know about that lived in the South, that lived in the North, etc., all those families that were called black, what would you say is the percentage of white DNA in the black population? Is it really a black population, or is it a 75% black population, or 50%? No, 50% probably not. What would you say? To what extent is the black population in this country that we call simply black, according to their DNA, white? And that's so horrifying that was always ignored by those people who produced these half-black children and so on and so forth, forced themselves onto the slaves.
Did everyone hear that question?
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't repeat it then. But I think I hope I haven't given a misleading impression here, because what I tried to say at the beginning was I do not believe that there is such thing as race. You know, obviously there's human variation. But I don't think that there's anything that approximates a concept called race. So obviously I don't believe that there are really black or white people. These are social conventions. And that's the sense in which I'm talking about it. I mean, I did mention that in the South, people who are phenotypically white have been classified as black, simply because of their ancestry. So it has nothing to do with genetics, right? I mean, and in the United States, and this is a peculiarity of American history as opposed to, let's say, the history of South America or the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, which is a little more obvious, because there was not a significant white settler population, the need to create a class of people between the slaves and the masters was more pressing. So what did they do? They said, okay, people who are of mixed ancestry, you're going to be mulattoes, and you are going to be a free people, right? That's what happened in Haiti, it's what happened in Jamaica. So the blacks are people in slavery, the so-called mulatto class are the buffer class between the masters and the slaves. But you see, in the United States, there was never a need for that. In the United States, it was a white settler colony. So they said, anybody who's not white is simply black. So do you see what I'm saying? Blackness is situational. It means one thing in Brazil, it means another thing in the United States, it means a third thing in Trinidad. So I don't believe there's any sense in talking about the genetics of it. The genetics of it are nonsense. It's not 50%, it's not 60%, it's not any of it, because none of it is real anyway. Right? And I agree with you that Obama, in principle, could have been a white president, but not in the United States. You see, that's what I'm saying. In some other country, to make the point clear, Jean-Claude Duvalier said, he was the ex-dictator of Haiti, right? And he was asked, what is the population of whites in Haiti? And he gave some absurd number, right? And the actual population by American terms would be something like 1%. But I can't remember what he said. But he said something like maybe 90%. And he said, what? And the interviewer said, what do you mean? 90% white population? He said, well, yeah, one drop of white blood makes you white. Right? So, whiteness, blackness, what do any of this stuff? What does any of it mean? It only has meaning in the context in which it arose. And that's the sense in which you have to understand it and speak of it. I never would speak of race as if I thought it was some kind of natural reality, because I don't believe that it is. Right? Nobody's ever actually been able to define what race is. Nobody's ever actually been able to say this is, or how many races there are. There's 5, there's 7, there's 12, there's, So it's all absurd. It's all absurd. But it's completely real and meaningful when you grasp it as a social convention. And that's the sense in which white and black are realities in America. I think this lady here was next, and then...
So, two quick television suggestions. Last night's American Experience was about the Chinese exclusion law, worth looking at. And Frontline had done a 2-night version of The Color of Law about the laws, the book that you
the Rothstein book, yeah.
Yes, very worth looking it up. It was almost a year ago now that came out. And I have a question for you as a professor of literature. Can you reflect on Afrofuturism and how it has attempted to relook at race similarly to how you were just speaking?
Yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot of creative thinking around race in America. And a lot, and you know, and in some ways that's been true of the culture forever. I mean, there's you know, blackness is always in some sense an invented thing. It's partly invented by whites, but it's also partly invented by blacks. And there was a necessity on the part of the African people and the African American people to invent some kind of group identity once they'd lost their African identity. So blackness came to kind of fill that void, you know, in the sense that people could no longer say that they were Ibu or Mandingo or Hausa or whatever. So, you know, and it wasn't clear what it meant to say you were American, so it was easy enough to focus in on blackness. So I would emphasize that whiteness and blackness are not static categories. I think they're always being reinvented. There's always a kind of futuristic edge to them. I think the interesting thing about whiteness in America, though, is that it may have run aground. You know, I mean by that is that I think the last people left really thinking consciously about whiteness are the white supremacists and the white nationalists. They are the last people who really take it seriously. You know, and that's what's driven them into this kind of activism, right? That they feel that they have to defend it because the rest of the American people won't. So I agree with you. I think we're in a much better place than we were in 1955. Much better. I think, you know, you look at American history, you have to say these are the good days, as terrible as they might seem. But because so much of the culture has been educated, so much of the culture has moved beyond. I don't think I mean, try to think of a day when it was, you know, let's say 1925, and in Alabama, and someone is accused of a crime, and someone says, you know, we're going to go and get that nigger. And 10,000 people would turn up. They would turn up from out state sometimes. People would bring their families. The police just stood by and watched it all happen. Sometimes they were involved. The federal government just stood by and watched it all happen. They would go to the jail and they'd say, give us that boy. And the police, sometimes the officers would try to be police officers, and they'd say, no, you're not taking my prisoner. But most often they said, yeah, take it. They took the person, did, you know, horrible tortures, burned them alive. 1925. And this happened over 5,000 times. We don't even know how often it happened. We don't even know. People were thrown into swamps, all the rest of it. You can't imagine that happening today. You just can't imagine that would happen today. You can't imagine that people would be that desensitized. I mean, the whole population is criminalized when that happens. You see, that's what I'm saying about how damaging it is. Everybody is morally degraded when that happens because they allow it to happen. In a country of laws, this is a country of law. And yet people could commit murder. They were never charged. Never charged. People knew who they were. They didn't even wear masks. If you could look on some of these postcards, they're there and they're laughing and they're pointing at the body and all of this sort of stuff. There was no social shame in that whatsoever. None. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. When you think of that, you have to say that we're in a better place today. You have to. You have to say that we've become more civilized. We don't allow it. You remember the case in Jasper, Texas, where James Byrd was picked up off the streets and dragged behind on a pickup truck. I mean, that's a modern day lynching, but we did not accept it as a society. The man who did that was recently executed in the state of Texas. Not that I'm in favor of capital punishment, but we made him pay the price for that. We didn't make anyone pay the price in 1925. No price whatsoever. No shame, that's the thing. Not even shame. The people who did this didn't even feel like they were unusual. Nobody said to them, how could you do that? So, Yeah, we're in a much better place. Much better place. I think Bill and then you would say.
Okay, given all this and those great 10 points for progress that you made, it really seems, at least I'm aware of, a great deal of what I would call institutional racism.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the question for you would be, dealing with this all your life, is what strategies can the public follow to have a meaningful effect to minimize institutional racism, including corporations and institutional sexism? I mean, what your 10 points would, I would think, from the bottom up, that would work eventually, but it's out there. I mean, I taught school in Hartford not that long ago, and I was surrounded by it on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. I think the first thing is, going back to Blanche's question, I think the first thing is to become conscious. Is to become conscious when we're in settings. And I think the same is true of sexism, right? I think the same is true. It's the air we breathe. So if we want to be, people who fight against the oppression of women, we have to see what it is. We have to see it where it is, because it's not always obvious. It's insidious little behaviors. A friend of mine is a vice president of an insurance company, and she tells me about the ceiling, and just how she's seen people who come from behind her, men, just pass her. Just go beyond her. And she says it's subtle. It's like when you're in the restaurant, and it's the way that the other senior executives talk to you, or pass something to you, or patronize you. The way they might call you by your first name instead of Ms. It's stuff like that. So I think the first thing is to become conscious in your own person and in your own conduct of life. Because the first thing we can always do, obviously, is take care of ourselves. We can't judge anybody else. If we don't do the work, what right do we have to judge other people? We don't. We can't call other people racist, this or that, or sexist, this, if we don't, first of all, make the effort in ourselves. So once we've made that effort, then I think the thing that you have to do is you have to get involved with other like-minded people. Now, I don't think there's any secret. I'm not any wiser than you on this issue. I think it's clear the culture will only change when enough people make the effort to change it. And one thing is clear, I don't think we can rely on the political system. I don't think we can rely on elected politicians to do this for us. Because these people, many of them, I think Trump is an example, but he's not the only one, because Democrats will do it too. They make use of divisions for their purposes. They make use of divisions for their purposes. That's why I say Trump is the worst thing that could have happened to the United States, but in some ways also he's a good thing. He's the worst thing because of the way he's making Americans fight each other. It's like, to me, it's like he's thrown a bone on the ground and said, go for it. And two dogs are just killing each other. That's what he's doing. But in a way that's, as bad as that is, that does also give us an insight into who we are. We are behaving like dogs fighting over a bone. And at some point, one of us is going to have to say, you know what, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this. So I definitely don't believe that America will improve through the political system. I think the American people have to do it. They have to do it. And in a way, that's how it should be. It's a moral question. It's not a question of policy or electability or any of those things. It's just the way the abolitionists used to talk about slavery. Either you're for it or you're against it. It's as simple as that. There's no middle ground. I think so.
I heard an interesting thing the other day that there's been some talk about implicit racism and in our culture, and interesting thing that I heard the other day about the way in which the news media, I don't want to say maybe fosters it or buys into it or reflects it. I'm not sure which is the right way to
They're all right.
But just imagine reading a headline over some incident that happened and it has either the word black or white or both in it. If you can imagine that it would be absolutely ludicrous and nobody would even write it if you flipped those adjectives, that's an example of how the racism is just so implicit.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, we have phrases in the United States like black crime, We have a phrase like that.
Right.
When you think about it, we don't actually have a phrase that like white crime. We have a phrase black crime. And really, the thing that's so insidious about that is obviously, first of all, it tars every black person with that, as if they were somehow criminally inclined. And what it really misses the point, most crime of a street variety, robberies, personal assaults, are done by the poor or lower income people. Why don't we describe it as working class crime?
Yeah.
That's really what it is. Most criminality is actually by class. The kinds of crime that are committed. Corporate executives commit crime. We don't call that white crime. Most of the corporate executives are white. Vast majority of people doing Wall Street fraud are white. But it would be absurd to call it white crime. We would just say this is the crime of the financial class. We understand it as an economic phenomenon because it makes sense to understand it that way. But when it comes to street crime, we understand it in racial terms, which is absurd. I mean, most African Americans are not committing crime and never will. It's a sizable minority, but that has to do with their economic conditions. It's just exactly the way that the Irish were considered a criminal people in the 19th century. It was very common. That's where we get phrases like paddy wagon, right? Because it was just about going out and picking up fighting drunken Irishmen off the streets. But now we don't say that that's the Irish. We understand, that's an economic phenomenon. People who are poor and desperate and stressed by life, that this is the way it plays out. I mean, the United States is not unusual in having a high level of crime. Britain is a high crime society. And it's class, it's not race. It's not race. It doesn't help us to understand it by putting it in those terms. I think there was a question. Now I think you were next, yeah. I'm trying my best to kind of keep a memory.
You're doing
I remember
great.
your hand going up.
I underlying a lot of this is our basis on competition as opposed to cooperation.
Definitely.
And I think, and when I talk about diversity with my students, I always say, unfortunately, your feelings are what we ignore, and they come from the people we love the most.
Yeah.
Our parents, our teachers, our preachers, our priests, that have given, but to be reflective on that and say, why do I feel this way when you're acting in that way? And I think even in schools, I was appalled at how many universities on 9/11 faculty taught their lesson that day and didn't stop and say, how are you feeling?
Yeah.
Because universities and schools are so in their heads and not in their hearts.
Yeah.
And I just think that lack of socio-emotional training that we get as Americans to say, why do I feel this way? And is that the way I want to feel? And if I don't, what am I going to do about it? I think those are critical to what's underlying some of these racism, sexism, homophobia.
I could not. Do I need to repeat that to everyone hear that? Because I could not agree more. I think that I'm a politically minded person, but I do think politics begins in the heart.
Yeah.
And I think the way I would look at a lot of the way the world is organized, it's like a war on empathy. Mm-hmm. That's basically societies operate, hierarchical, divided societies operate by killing empathy. They make us indifferent to other people. Yeah. And I remember when I first arrived in the United States, and the first time I go through Port Authority, and there's just homeless people everywhere. It's just everywhere. And I'd never seen anything like that. Just, this is a major city, one of the major cities in the world. And there's people lying on blankets and all this kind of stuff. And then there are, and there's people walking through. There's so much money in New York City. It's like half the world's wealth flows through New York City, and you would never know it. You would never know it. When I think of the way that Americans respond to the poor, Americans are a charitable, generous people, but there's also a degree of social callousness built into this. We're a society that says, get a job. That's our response. Yeah. Someone's desperate. They look like, they're about to fall apart, we say, get a job. And we think that that is a moral response. And we do that as a society. It's one thing as, you know, as an individual, because none of us can solve homelessness on our own. So I'm not saying that, you know, we should always, I'm not saying that. I'm saying we should do it at the level of the citizenry. We should do it at the level of a community where we say we're not going to allow people with children to be on the streets. That's unacceptable to us as a people. Instead of blaming the victims, that's where the lack of empathy comes in. Even if it was their fault, so what? So what? Even if they put themselves on the street by decisions that they made, so what? They're human beings. Not going to leave. Are we going to really just leave them there and say tough luck and tough to your kids too? That's not a great people. See, that's what I'm saying. A great people says, you know, and every moral religion teaches this. Every religion teaches it's right there. It's there in Judaism. It's there in Christianity. It's there in Islam. You know, help those in need.
Well, actually what you were talking about was something I was going to comment on, was that racism may be through American history, but the other really big driving force, so one of them is individualism.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of talking to that, so that it's not just against people of different races, but you talked about the economic difference. So the sense that if you were hardworking and you applied yourself and your duty is to take care of yourself, and if you do well, you do that, you do well. So if you're not doing well, you don't have to blame the victim thing. And in some cases people are a victim, and sometimes they're not. But that strong sense of virtue and individuality is such a, I think, uniquely or stronger in the United States than other countries, that complicates things, I think.
It's mostly mythological, though.
Well,
You know, that's the sad thing. I think individualism, you know, and you're right, it's a very powerful part of the American tradition, but it's mostly myth. I mean, think for example, about things like the Homestead Act, where the government seizes land from Native American people and says, whoever can get out into the territories, that's yours. And they deny African Americans the right to be part of that, right? That's not individualism. That's just simply the government giving you stuff.
Yeah.
And you know, the history of America I mean, they're full of things where Americans fail to see the social welfare that they get from the community at large. I mean, we know this, the mortgage interest relief, I mean, all the kind of social policies. They don't go as far as they do in other countries, you know, but they're there. And the tragedy is, you know, that individualism basically died as a meaningful philosophy around the Great Depression. I mean, it was pretty clear that Americans did not do this to themselves. The country more or less collapsed. People were poor. People were, you know, and individualism wasn't going to help. There was no job market for people to get jobs. You could go from Kentucky, or people did, right? They left the South and headed out west. It wasn't any better out there. So individualism has simply collapsed as a way of thinking about society round about the Great Depression. And from then on, we've just been living the myth. We pretend that people make these great fortunes, or they don't. They do it on the back of society at large. You know, I think Obama said that at one point, and people got outraged. He said, "You didn't build it." You know, and he said, "What do you mean I didn't build it?" But it's true, you didn't build it. You did not build it. The society as a whole built it. You name anything, the internet, any one of a number of them, they're all social products, all of them. Certain individuals get to benefit, but that doesn't mean that it's theirs.
Can you comment on police and other agents of the state as being reflective of what was referred to as the institutionalized values of society that you're speaking about?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the policing of black communities today is entirely consistent with the history of American culture. It's not anything new. The only thing that's new about it is the visibility. We get to see it because of the cell phones and the cameras and this kind of stuff. It's always been something like this. Because the assumption is, I mean, what is the history of policing in the United States? Well, a lot of it goes back to slave patrols. And the slave patrol model was all about saying that blacks in public space have to have a reason to be in public space. And if they don't have a reason, they don't belong there. That mentality passed into the culture of segregation, right? Where segregation was the control of where blacks could be in public space. and it was enforced by the police. I mean, it was technically illegal for you to be somewhere, where you didn't belong. So this is the history, again, of the United States. I mean, it's not that modern policing is legally permitted to do this, but it's culturally permitted to do it. We allow the police to do it culturally.
Yeah.
We haven't devised a serious model of police reform in the United States. A lot of implicit bias, and a lot of explicit bias too. It's not just implicit. I mean, if we're honest, we would admit there are organized white supremacist groups within the police. That's a fact. The FBI has actually shown this. So we can't be surprised at the policing that we get. I'm not surprised. And I should also point out that you will see sometimes that black police officers brutalize black citizenry because they're operating. It's just the same logic as a black overseer operating on a plantation. It doesn't change the fact that policing is racist in America. It doesn't change that. The fact that the color of the officer doesn't have anything to do with it. It's who they're mistreating, right? Because I can guarantee you, black police officers do not mistreat white citizenry. They don't do that, but they mistreat black citizenry because they know they have cop permission to do that. Right. I think.
No, I have something.
Yeah,
You asked a question early in your remarks. You said, why do African Americans sit together?
Mm-hmm.
At the first...
Some. Yeah.
Well,
some.
okay.
Why
do some African Americans sit together? At the first College of Liberal Arts and Sciences gathering at the Alumni Center, that question was asked.
Mm-hmm.
And there were two black women among all the white faces. And one of them said, because we know each other, for one thing. The other thing I want to say is that the new National Review magazine has an article is devoted entirely to the question of socialism. The National Review is a conservative magazine. I did look at the final essay, and they seemed to be opposed to community, and I found that pretty offensive. And period.
I would agree with you. I think in the end, Americans will have to be a community, or they won't be a United States. The choice is up to the American people.
Jerry, we'd like to present you
Oh.
our official CLIR motto.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.